Hi, I'm Ben, and one second, I need to fix something. Much better. Well, this won't be necessarily surprising nor controversial. I enjoy art. Even less surprising, I enjoy watching films. And one thing that I've kind of always noticed in art and whatnot is the many different ways that art manages to capture life. One way that I've seen this happen in films is by using the themes of love and death. And well, that is very broad, and I'm sure that there's just about every movie in some way has addressed these themes. I think that it can be a way that no matter how out there your movie is, or whatever piece of art you're doing, that you can really connect to the audience. Throughout my experience of watching movies, there's been a number of movies that have stood out to me and that I've had a soft spot for, as bizarre they are in the ways that they're put together, that they find an interesting way to connect to these aforementioned themes of love and death. The 4 movies that I'd like to talk about today are Hirokazu Koreeda's Afterlife, released in 1998, Yorgos Lanthimos' The Lobster, which released in 2015, David Lowery's A Ghost Story, which released in 2017, and Miranda July's Kajillionaire, which released in 2020. I think that their shared use of the themes of love and death are something that I can really appreciate, and something that I think that by diving into, we can kind of help understand why filmmakers portray life in the ways that they do, and the different ways that through using these themes they can connect with an audience. So, many of these movies that I'm talking about are a little bit out there. You'll see when I get into them. But one thing that I think we can start out with is maybe Kajillionaire would be the best place for us to start, as it's probably the easiest to dive into. Anyways, let's get right into it. Kajillionaire follows a less than functional family of grifters, and specifically their daughter, Old Dolio, a 26-year-old who has spent her entire life having to go through with all of her parents' different get-rich-quick schemes to try to get by. Among the ever-changing lives of being full-time con men, Old Dolio's parents have failed to show her any real form of love or really any attachment, and through this have kind of neglected her emotionally, leaving her in a place of any time that she's failed to connect to people. They simply claim that she doesn't have tender feelings. Right. So, in this neglect and emotional disarray of a family, Old Dolio has obviously experienced a lot of anxiety about life and never really being able to trust someone, as her parents have shown that whenever they can, they'll often misuse someone's trust just to make a couple of dollars. As the film progresses, Old Dolio becomes more exposed to the outside life outside of her parents' manipulative grasp and begins to discover what a healthy relationship might look like, compared to her relationship with her parents, which has been almost entirely based off of trust for the sake of survival and making sure that they're able to get away with their schemes. The catalyst of this revelation in Old Dolio managing to create some room between her and her parents and understand the world separately from the ways that they have influenced her and the lack of trust and everything is in her relationship with Melanie. Melanie is an interesting character and a unlikely accomplice in a scheme that Old Dolio sets up to commit luggage fraud, and as the film progresses becomes closer and closer with the family, and eventually more or less becoming a part of it. As the film goes on, Melanie continues aiding them in their exploits, getting closer to the family, and as the film goes, there are a few motifs that appear, specifically in Old Dolio's character, as she begins to understand the world from a different perspective. An example of a reoccurring motif through the film is that Old Dolio's father, Robert, has a continuous fear of earthquakes, and living in Southern California, the fear of the big one. And this fear has caused that any time that there is any earthquake, or really any shaking, the entire family has this bout of anxiety and fear over the fact that they may die from the big one. This first introduces the character of Melanie as they're on the plane doing the luggage fraud, that they experience some turbulence, causing Robert to talk to Melanie and ask for her to calm him down. This motif continues through the rest of the film and affects the characters in many different ways, and eventually, as I will get to later, becomes a very important point in old Dolio's life. Another strange motif that appears through the film is old Dolio's fascination with early childhood and infant care from their parents. This happens as old Dolio goes to a maternity class on behalf of another person to score a few extra bucks for the family. And at this class they talk about the different ways that children, when they're newborn, connect with their parents and create a bond with them. Old Dolio then goes on to ask her parents if they'd ever made these connections, and her parent essentially shrug it off. Eventually, at a later point in the film, Chekhov's earthquake, as it were, finally goes off, and as old Dolio and Melanie are in a gas station bathroom, entirely shrouded in the dark. Well, this is an odd situation for the two of them. This also comes as a very important point in the movie, as old Dolio seems to be experiencing what she believes is death. She thinks that she and Melanie have died and that this was the big one, as it were, that this earthquake has ended, as previously her father had said, that the big one, when it happens, is going to end in size. So, now old Dolio, thinking that she's experienced death, suddenly goes into this frightened state and kind of gives up on some of the previous things that had been holding her back, feeling like now she can really go for those things and realizing that she never really experienced much of her life, and that a lot of it was held back from how she experienced it, and that she was always kind of scared of experiencing real life and whatnot because of the ways that her parents had treated. This paradigm shift finally allows her to experience love, and that she realizes that her parents hadn't really ever shown that to her, only really treating her with respect in terms of her ability to be a con artist and help them score a few extra bucks. In this time of great uncertainty for old Dolio, Melanie steps in and continues looking after her, as she is now experiencing the world from a new angle that she hadn't previously. This, I think, is the core of the film, and how in their experiencing what they believe to be death, she is able to find love and find support from Melanie. I found that the movie was a little bit hard to follow at points while watching it, as it has a very distinctive and kind of bizarre abstract style, and just the fact that all of the dialogue feels a little bit choppy, but purposefully so, not in a sense that it's bad acting or bad writing or anything, but in a sense that everyone seems to be brutally honest in situations when they talk, oftentimes, most likely, through the family, and how they treat old Dolio head-on, oftentimes, again, saying that she doesn't have tender feelings or just doesn't understand the world around her, almost making it seem like it was her fault. Being a heist movie with some coming-of-age qualities and other weirdness going on in this movie, I feel like it is a hard one at first to fully unpack, but I think that in this experience of her thinking that she has died, and then being able to find love afterwards, that we can really kind of start to understand these characters, and understand that sometimes the things that are holding them back are the things that they fear most. In this case, old Dolio realizes that through her experience of what she believes to be death, that she never really got to experience life and experience love. So, coming out of that experience, she's able to start a new relationship and with life, and be able to fully experience something new. Because of how old Dolio had been treated growing up, and the ways that she experienced life, the only way that she was able to find love was through her experience of what she thought to be death. In other words, through death she found love. The next film that I would like to talk about is David Lowery's A Ghost Story. Now this film does have some similar connections to Kajillionaire in the ways that love and death are interconnected, but I feel like it attempts to take the theme of death much more head-on. This is because A Ghost Story portrays Casey Affleck's character, only referred in the credits as C, as he dies very suddenly. In life, he was a newlywed recording artist, married to Rooney Mara's character, referred in the credits again as M. The film follows C, as after he has died, he wakes up as a ghost, clad in a cartoony ghost sheet. While this does seem somewhat out of place for the film, seeing as the dark tone and the theming around death and everything, it does create a very interesting atmosphere for the rest of the movie. A Ghost Story is a very interesting and somewhat difficult film to talk about, as unlike many other movies, like Kajillionaire, that are much more narratively focused, A Ghost Story focuses less on the narrative and contains, in fact, very little dialogue. This forces our understanding and kind of connections to the movie to be shifted away from looking at the text and even subtext to even just looking at other factors in the film and how they affect it. First example of this that I want to mention is how the film uses a very traditional 1.33 by 1 or 4:3 aspect ratio. For other movies this may seem like completely an unnecessary detail to talk about, but since this film is so minimalistic, we must look at pretty much everything that is given to us. In this case, I think it also can tell us a lot about the story and how we are to connect with these characters. The use of this aspect ratio was a very deliberate decision, as the film, being released in 2017, meant that there was no technical or even artistic constraint for the reasons for why this would need to be chosen as the aspect ratio, but instead was a very deliberate decision that David Lowery chose. To help us understand this decision, we need to understand a little bit more about the history of the 4:3 aspect ratio. And while I know this doesn't sound very interesting, if you want to read more, a good source of information on this matter is the blog article on A24's website by Kelly Conaboy titled The Rise, Fall, and Return of the 4:3 aspect ratio, as it's very informative and frankly more interesting than I would trust myself to be able to make a full conversation about the history of aspect ratios. So, to boil it down a little bit, the 4:3 aspect ratio has been one of the longest running used aspect ratios in filmmaking, as in being used in some of the earliest French silent films. In later years, as the talkie was introduced, or as we know movies today, movies with sound, the Academy standard was brought in, being only a little bit wider than the 1.33 by 1 aspect ratio. At 1.37 by 1, it is effectively treated as the same aspect ratio. From Casablanca to Citizen Kane, this Academy ratio is what was used for a very long time until filmmakers decided to use wider and wider shots to capture more. This then led to the introduction of widescreen formats such as 16 by 9, what this video is shot in, and even wider formats such as IMAX or other super wide formats. So, why does a ghost story, for being made in 2017, use this arguably outdated aspect ratio? Well, I think that there's a number of reasons for this, one being clearly that it is a deliberate stylistic decision trying to capture this film in a different way than you would normally be used to. And I think that the specific use of the 4:3 aspect ratio, in this case, makes the film feel very cozy, if not too close for comfort, causing some discomfort for the audience while still feeling like they're almost looking through the window of someone else's house. The 4:3 aspect ratio nowadays is used more and seen more in television programs, or older television programs now at that, and in home videos. So the use of the aspect ratio is certainly drawing a connection and a parallel to previous forms of media that you would oftentimes watch in your home. I think that this aspect ratio also is very important to look at, as it distances the audience a little bit from the story, much in the same way that C has been distanced from his own life. This is seen as even in the widest shots in this film, everything still feels somewhat claustrophobic, as if you're trapped in this life with these people, which helps the audience empathize a lot with the character of C, as he's forced to watch his life pass by him, and watch everyone else around him age and move away while he has to stay in that house. A recurring pattern that seems to follow C throughout the film is that he keeps on trying to chip away at one little section of the wall in their house. This is because in a previous scene, M explains that she has left these little notes for herself to come back to if she ever finds them again, to kind of remind herself of those places that she's been in, saying that when she was a little girl and used to move around all the time, that she would write these notes and fold them up really, really small and hide them. And throughout the film, C keeps trying to chip at this doorframe in this house that he has seen M leave a note at, attempting to finally get one last shared experience with his wife. So as time progresses, and C keeps on trying to chip away at this wall, time eventually loops around on itself until the time moves past the time in that house. As in a previous scene, M had described that she never really wanted to live in that house, and that it had mostly just been that C had had a deep connection with it. This ends up being very ironic when seen through the perspective of C, as he sees this house now as an almost prison of sorts for him. As time passes, M eventually moves on and moves out of the house, leaving a new family there. Unfortunately, C feels only more distant from this house, as now not only does he not know the house as it was, but he doesn't know the people that live there or even speak the same language as them. This continues to distance C as he continues just chipping away at one little section of wall, until time eventually trails off into infinity and back around to the start of the original history of the property. There's one important scene that I would like to mention within the film, which is that at one point, M is listening to a song that C had created before he had died. In this scene, as she listens to the song, she lies on the floor of their house and reaches out her hand, almost to touch the veil of C's ghost sheet. Unfortunately, the song ends as the film does focus on the passage of time, and this shows that even in the moments where they're sharing their time together, that the time will continue to pass and that their time together will not be forever. At the end of the film, C manages to get to the piece of paper that M had hidden in the wall, and as he finally reaches it, he disperses from underneath the sheet, finally given freedom. I think that this shows an almost opposite relation to Kajillionaire and how the film deals with its themes of love and death. As in Kajillionaire, love is found through the experience of a presumed death, and in this case, only through the image of the love and being able to finally connect, and only through connecting emotionally with M was C able to finally get rest and be free from living as a ghost. While the contents of the note are not divulged to the audience, even if they were, it likely would have been something incredibly personal that, because of the distance that has been put between the characters and the audience, would have likely not meant anything to the audience. And as C finally gets the note, he is given the release of death through his love, a very poetic ending for a strangely poetic film. The next film that I'd like to talk about is Yorgos Lanthimos' The Lobster. Yorgos Lanthimos is a very interesting artist, as uniquely it seems that Lanthimos is most comfortable in his style when it's at its most bleak. The Lobster, released in 2015, is a key example of this, as many other directors could take the basic log line of this film and portray the story as essentially a romantic comedy. Instead, Lanthimos chooses to create an absurdist dystopian dark comedy set in a very bizarre and almost clinical setting. The Lobster follows David, played by Colin Farrell, as he's put through a compulsory program in which all single people in the city have to be taken to this hotel and within 45 days find someone they love. If they do not, they are turned into an animal of their choice and sent out into the wild. David decides that if he had to, he would choose to live as a lobster, as, quote, "They live for over 100 years, are blue-blooded like aristocrats, and stay fertile all of their lives." This is a very important line in the film, not only for helping the audience understand the tone of the film, but also to look into the psyche of David. This line illustrates David's two largest fears, death and not finding love. From very early in the film, this discloses to the audience, as well as the other characters around him, that love and death are concepts that he is regularly anxious about, wanting to ensure that if something might go wrong, that he would still have his life as a lobster as a kind of insurance policy. The film offers very few clear answers about almost anything throughout the film, letting the story unfold largely through small pieces of dialogue with some narration to give the audience some insight into David's thoughts as well as who the narrator is as the film goes on. At the hotel, David befriends two other men looking for a partner, a man with a lisp, played by John C. Reilly, and a man with a limp, who's played by Ben Winshaw. These traits become their defining characteristics, as for two people to be compatible in the film, but they need to share a specific trait that they have in common. As time goes on, the man with the limp worries about not being able to find a match, and he sees a woman who introduced herself with the fact that she often has nosebleeds, swimming in the hotel pool. Wanting to pair with her, the man with the limp goes into the pool, explaining that he likes to swim, but instead of realizing that this is a trait they have in common, he instead slams his nose on the pool deck when she begins to swim away, making it seem although he's having a nosebleed when she turns around again. This interaction begins a pattern throughout the film of characters physically injuring themselves for the intention of being a better pair for the partner to be. About halfway through, there's a very clear crossing the threshold moment that is not so subtly shown as David escapes the hotel through the transformation room. Again, very subtle. This starts David's life as a loner, being found by a group of other loners that were able to escape the hotel, now living by a strict set of rules that go against the hotel's rules almost entirely, instead of enforcing romantic relationships, violently outlawing them with cruel punishments. David eventually meets another loner, who has been the narrator throughout the film, telling of hers and David's story. While starting off trying to follow the rules of the loners, the two begin to realize that they have feelings for each other, and better yet, are both nearsighted, making them a socially acceptable pair. However, this doesn't last very long, as the leader of the loners catches on to what might be happening, taking the nearsighted woman to the city and has her medically blinded to crush the chances of her and David being together. Obviously dismayed by this development, David tries to keep the now blinded woman entertained at the camp while still trying to be with her in secret. Eventually, David develops a plan for the two of them to leave the loner group and move into the city to become a pair. The only problem now is that the woman and him do not have a distinctive trait to prove their compatibility, but David is willing to make a sacrifice. The final development of the film is the conflict between essentially being left for dead as loners, or for David to potentially kill himself trying to become compatible with the woman he loves. And this is more or less where the film leaves off, never revealing if David's act of love resulted in death, but considering the previous introduction of the man with the limp and his series of self-inflicted wounds keeping his relationship alive, the film sticks the landing in terms of how it fuses the concepts of love and death together, showing that in a world where the only other option to love is incredibly dangerous, living as a vulnerable animal, love and death almost go hand in hand. This final development is also an interesting one to look at, as it switches David's previous notion on the head of him wanting to be a lobster to give him some insurance for both his safety and his ability to find love, in this case essentially putting all of his eggs in one basket, potentially risking his life to be with the woman he loves. Last but certainly not least, we have Hirokazu Koreeda's Afterlife. And no, I hate to have to specify this, but not the Ricky Gervais Netflix series. This film is quite possibly one of the most personally influential pieces of media in my life, and I will admit the sleepy tone, slow pacing, and many hazily cool shots throughout the film may stand out from the traditional spectacle or vibrancy one might expect from an influential film. Koreeda has a way with breathing life into every minute detail and character that he creates, to form windows into the lives of the characters to let the audience be invited into. Afterlife, in my opinion, exemplifies these qualities and what makes Koreeda's films tick. Afterlife proposes a simple question. What one memory from your life would you choose to keep with you as you are taken into the afterlife? This is a question that has sat with me since my first viewing of the film, as it's a question that could take my whole life to answer. Often when faced with the reality of death, I feel like most films, books, or other forms of media would address it as a tragedy or a great loss of life. However, in this film, I find that death is taken very head-on from a very humanistic perspective as being the side effect of life. Each character that is interviewed has come to terms with the fact that they are dead, forcing the audience to watch from a distance as each interviewee is tasked with finding one culminative memory to represent themselves by. One notable feature is that Koreeda, who had a history of documentary and news production, chose to have a few real people explaining some of their fondest memories for the interview portion of the film. This choice of having a few real people telling the stories from their lives, this use of having some real people well used rather than just actors for the interview segments, makes the film feel much more realistic, in addition with some specific filmmaking techniques, such as shooting on a type of film that had mostly just been used in Japan for documentary features. All of this makes the film feel much more lifelike, and in some cases feel like you are watching a documentary. The film also has a balance between focusing on not only the people being interviewed, but the people doing the interviews. As it is explained later on in the movie, those who are not able to choose a memory are then the ones who are tasked with helping others choose their memories, and finding a way to appropriately represent the lives of each person, despite many of them having very complex or bittersweet emotions in regards to how they lived their lives. While the theme of death in this film is very clearly prevalent, I think that it is a little bit harder to find where the themes of love come in. One of the counselors in particular, Takashi, who was 22 when he had died, is given lots of screen time as information is slowly revealed about his character. Takashi had died so young as he was a Japanese soldier in World War II, leaving him unable to choose a memory as he had felt that his life was mostly just his childhood, then the war, leaving very few good memories in his life. Through the interviews with another one of the characters, he manages to learn that he had a wife before he had gone to the war, that he had completely forgotten about from the trauma. He learns that years down the line, there was another man who had married her, but she had always talked about the experience of sitting on a bench with Takashi before he had gone off to war. This eventually opens up the floodgates for Takashi as he's able to choose one memory of being that memory that helps someone else find love in something that they had enjoyed, and he was able to find love through his experience of death. Okay, so, what now? What do I mean by taking each of these films and talking about these themes? At this point in my process in making my script, I've hit a little bit of a wall. I know all of the reasons why I love these films, and why I think they're interesting, but why should you care? A lot of you have almost certainly never heard of these movies, whether it be because they're very outhouse film that slid under your radar, or in the case of Afterlife, it was a Japanese film from 1998, so I'm certainly not imagining that many of you would be familiar with it. I know that a lot of you have almost certainly never seen these films, and even if you have, you might not have even liked them or even cared, but give me a second. So, why do these films interest me so much? Well, as I stated at the top of the video, I think that these films capture a certain sense of reality through their depictions of love and death. What I would argue is that these two themes, if depicted purposefully enough, can make even the most abstract or surrealist films capture a sense of understanding for life that can bridge the gap from the artistic representation into a deeper understanding of the characters' inner experiences of the world. I think that this is something that's very important, as it can make or break the audience's connection to the story, and impact their suspension of disbelief. I think one thing that has stayed with me through all of this, how each film manages to depict very human and realistic characters that anchor the films in their emotional cores. With this anchor, it allows the films to be more abstract and stretch stylistic. There's something that I previously withheld when talking about Afterlife that I think can help tie this together. You see, Afterlife has been a film that has captured my attention for a very long time, not only because of its question, and what memory would I choose after I died. Well, that is very interesting. I think the thing that has captured my attention more is what the agency does with these memories after the people have chosen one. But more importantly, I think that there's something to be said about the film's inherent love for filmmaking and the power it holds to depict the human experience. You see, in the film, when each person is tasked with choosing their memory, not only does each character have to choose a memory, but the counselors also help create a short film depicting that memory. Memory is something that is very malleable, as someone can have a very vivid memory of an event that another person may have experienced entirely differently, or simply not remembered. This, however, does not change the value of either person's understanding of the event, but simply changes its impact on the person. The film portrays this act of filmmaking in a way of immortalizing one's memory, solidifying it as the person's perspective on that moment from their life. This philosophy has bled into the ways that I experience films, as a way of experiencing one's view of the world, whether it be narrative, experimental, or in a documentary format, solidified in the process of filmmaking. Regardless of the many notable stylistic differences between each of the films, each film that I talked about is able to capture a unique yet relatable story, highlights very human emotions for the audience to be able to connect with. When you understand this concept, all of filmmaking has, as a whole, becomes much easier to compare to other forms of art and storytelling. For example, the bizarre tone of The Lobster, or the minimalism in A Ghost Story, can be compared to the stylistic vocabulary of a poem, or the brushstrokes on a painting. Trying to express an artist's understanding of the world around them, and allowing the audience or viewer a glimpse into how another person conceptualizes and understands the world. Compared to other art forms, filmmakers have the ability to capture almost absolute realism when making their films, as almost anyone can just set up a camera, or even their phone nowadays, and record an event as they experienced it. But really what pushes a filmmaker further is getting their understanding of something. Hirokazu Koreeda recently wrote an article for the Criterion Collection, in which he was talking about the process that he went through when making Afterlife, as he had previously wanted to make sure that he separated himself from whoever he was making a documentary or anything about. He said that, however, when he was making Afterlife, he fully was able to go into the minds of these people, and fully understand them from the inside out. This, I think, is what I find to be kind of the magic of filmmaking, as you're able to take these concepts and fully understand them from different angles than you can in real life. Don't get me wrong, I get that this all can feel a little bit abstract and all, but really I mostly just want to what I really want to mostly nail down is that you're able to understand the visual language and identify the themes of a film, and are able to understand the choices that a filmmaker makes. Watching films can be a very fulfilling experience, connecting the artist to their art, and connecting the artist to the audience in a very unique way. As I'm coming to a very large transitional period in my life, as my grade 12 year is quickly coming to a close, I have found a lot of comfort in these films, and as I said at the top of the video, I love diving into movies, and getting to live in these films as I made this video was an excellent experience. One thing that I've felt inspired by from these films, specifically Afterlife, is that I want to be able to save a memory for myself to take with me on my way out of my public school career. So I decided the best way for me to save these memories would be to look to the people that have made these memories with me.
As for my favorite high school memory, it is really hard to choose just one, from a locker full of a lot of rotten food, or messing around before a late volleyball practice, or seeing new people get real into the swim or track teams, or even just enjoying the mundanity of sitting on the floor and having a lunch with your friends every day. It doesn't matter what it was, I think it came down to the people.
My favorite memory was definitely finding a bolt that, get this, was really hot in the English class.
I'd say my favorite memory from high school would be my grade 12 history class, because I had an amazing teacher who made the course material very, very engaging, and I had classmates, more specifically a small group of classmates, who made me feel welcomed and great, just overall great to be there. Yeah.
In classic Ben fashion, he asked us to record videos at 11 p.m. the day before his project is due. He wanted us to talk about our memories, and I feel like one that applies to me and maybe a few people in my friend group is the Gatorade locker. It started off as this funny joke, and as the name suggests, we just put Gatorade in a locker, and then a jar of peanut butter, and then leftover KFC fries, and then a can of tuna, and then eggs. It became a rancid mess, and no one took responsibility for it. We all just kind of shared it. And then COVID hit. And then we came back in grade 10, and the hallway smelled like industrial cleaner. Oops. It's funny how we weren't even like good friends back then. We were just classmates. And sitting here 3 years later, I can say some of those people are some of my best friends. And I appreciate high school for giving us lockers.
Something that I have personally enjoyed about my grade 12 experience would probably be the fact that I've been able to meet new people and make more friends who are supportive and try to uplift me instead of hold me back. And I've just been able to surround myself with much more positive people.
My favorite memory from my high school career would be all the time I got to spend with the cross country and the track and field teams. Particularly in these last 2 years, because I wasn't really into it in grade 9, but after I started dedicating myself, I got to know how awesome everyone in the team was, and I got to spend time with some genuinely great people. And yeah, I really love that.
If I was to take one thing away from high school, it would be something that happened yesterday, which is Vlade's silly little dance that he did with everyone. And I remember stepping aside because I was getting tired because it was exhausting. And I'm out of shape. Doesn't matter. What matters is that I saw the class and I was like, wow, I've known these people for 4 years and they've changed so much and they've grown so much. And it was a moment of like reflection for me. And I don't know why it happened then and there, but it was like, damn, we've changed a lot. And some of us haven't changed at all, but some of us have changed a lot. And it's really interesting to see. So that's the memory I take away from high school.